Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host Henna Zuberi and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. We're on Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 and you can watch us on YouTube and Facebook as well. Joining us today is Dr. Frank Wilderson, who's the author of Afro-pessimism. Many of the systematic injustices we see today are an extension of a dark history of exploitation, slavery, racism, and mass murder. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking a lot about much of this. How we conceptualize the overall composition of society, racism, and race relations today may or may not force us into knowingly or unknowingly reinforce these historical and contemporary atrocities that have continuously manifested over time. So Dr. Wilkerson, so let me tell you about him, and I'll tell you why we invited him too. So one of the things that in my own anti-racism journey is learning from people around me, and a group of young, students, activists who have now obviously grown up a little bit, are the leaders of a beautiful struggle, and they're based in Baltimore City. And when we were talking about books to read and people to follow and study, one of the suggestions they made was Dr. Wilderson's book. And so today we're so honored to have him and ask him a lot of questions and get to know his work, and then ask him, how does this work apply to justice work today? One of our missions at Justice for All is, as you understand, the Islamic concept of qist, which is establishing justice in this world. So how do we use this theory, and what does it mean for so many of our Black brothers and sisters? So Dr. Wilkerson will discuss his new book, Afro-pessimism. He's an American writer, dramatist, filmmaker, and critic. He's a full professor of drama and African American studies at the University of California, Irvine. He received his BA from Dartmouth College and his master's in fine arts from Columbia University, and his PhD in rhetoric and film studies from the University of California, Berkeley. So Afro-pessimism argues that Blacks do not function as political subjects. Instead, our flesh and energies are instrumentalized for post-colonial immigrant, feminist, LGBT, and workers' agendas. This is a quote that I read about this movement, and I want to ask Dr. Wilkerson. So without further ado, let's have him in the studio and on screen. And welcome, Dr. Wilderson.
Thank you so much, Anna, for having me. Great to be here.
We're so happy to have you here and to discuss, this is not your first book. So I wanted to and I know there's a lot of history, and you've shared a lot of anecdotes from your own life in this new book, Afro-pessimism. But before we start, I wanted you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and how did you come to this point and to write such a stunning account of the Black experience and how it taints history and continues in today's power, the civilization today.
Yes, thank you. Well, I was born in 1956. I mainly grew up for grade school in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so from 62 to 68, I was in an all-white grade school in a rich neighborhood called Kenwood in Minnesota. And a lot of this book and my earlier first book is centered there. But then there was a formative period in my life, which was like 68 to 70, when I was between 12 and 14 years old. And my parents moved around a lot. as my mother was finishing her PhD and my dad was on sabbatical. And we, in moving in this, as many people in your audience may know, 1968 is a watershed year for revolutionary politics around the world. It's the year of May '68 in Paris, which almost toppled the Republic to turn it socialist. It's the year that Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia. It's the year of the Tet Offensive. It's the year in Vietnam. It's the year of the uh, Democratic Convention in in Chicago, where SDS and the Panthers leadership were put on trial for so-called inciting riots. And so this was a very transformative period for me as a tween and early to mid-teen. And one of the things that I reflect upon is the way in which Black energy and Black political organizing was dedicated to a kind of universal liberation of all oppressed people around the world. But slowly but surely, as the Vietnam War ended and things like this began to transform for non-Black people of color, the Black Liberation Army, which many people know through Assata Shakur's autobiography, one of the soldiers in the Black Liberation Army, Jalil Matakim, writes that in 1975, the mainly white radicals start to leave and they want to come back home. And so we're left by ourselves to struggle underground. And I really saw this, just to skip over another 30 years later, in 89 to 94, when I went to South Africa after getting my master's at Columbia, and I joined the African National Congress. It was the second Black American, maybe even American, to hold elected office in the ANC, and then worked underground. And I saw that there's a way in which Black people suffer that cannot be translated through and with the structure of other oppressed peoples. And I felt that the coalitions and the mass movements of the 60s, early 70s were similar to the experience that I was dealing with the Communist Party in South Africa, and that people who are radical and progressive aren't always ready to think about the way anti-Black violence is structurally different than the violence against non-Black people of color. And so that's kind of the isolation that I deal with. That's the short answer, but we can get deeper into some of these things as you direct me.
Yes, definitely. And this is something that you talk about. You talk about violence. Can you define especially when you talk about? I've read some of your pieces where you say that anti-Blackness is and civil, and its relationship with civil society and violence. Like, how do you define violence?
Yes, that's violence is at the. If Afro-pessimism as a critical theory is about one thing, it's about violence. I mean, it's really about many things. It deals with Blackness and gender, it deals with Blackness and the unconscious, Blackness and politics. But what makes it Afro-pessimism? What makes it Afro-pessimism is that there are about four major so-called macro narratives of liberation. One is the narrative, a theory of indigeneity that comes out of the American Indian movement. The other would be post-colonialism, which really gets kick-started in 1978 with Edward Said's book Orientalism. The other would be radical feminism. I don't mean reformist feminism. I mean the kind of feminism that wants to destroy the patriarchal structure rather than get women places within it. And that's basically, that is, the foundation for that has a lot to do with psychoanalysis. And the other, of course, is Marxism, class struggle and class domination. And one of the things that I was learning throughout my 50-odd years of thinking about these things was that even though all these theories strive for what we call in critical theory, they aspire to generalization. In other words, all critical theory aspires to say something essential about how suffering is structured.
Mhm.
But, and they would differ, like the radical feminists would say, you must destroy the patriarchal kinship structure in order to destroy the unethical civil society that we live in. The
Mm.
radical Marxists would say, no, you must destroy the capitalist mode of production in order to destroy the unethical world that we live in.
Mm.
The indigenous people would say, no, you have to destroy the settlerism of the Western Hemisphere. Post-colonialists will say something else based on the Battle of Algiers, the Palestinian struggle, etc. And they all think that they're irreconcilable. What we as Afro-pessimists saw was that at a certain important level, they are irreconcilable, but they can be reconciled in one thing, in that all these subjects of structural oppression suffer from the same kind of violence, which is called contingent violence, which
Okay.
means that they suffer from a paradigm that imposes itself upon them when they transgress the rules of the paradigm. That's a very key point. That's a very key point, because what we've argued is that the Black person in any community
Mhm.
is living in a structure of violence that cannot be reconciled with the other non-Black people of their community. And
Mm.
this structure of violence is called gratuitous. In other words, what we argue is that the rituals of lynching, police killings, performatively
Mm.
look like the rituals of police killings of Latinx people or Muslim people in Guantanamo Bay. They are the same performatively. But where anti-Black violence differs is that there's no trigger for it. There's
Mm.
no transgression. It's not a war between Muslims and Christians or oil. It's not a war between Israelis and Palestinians or land. It's not a war between workers and bosses or labor time. It's
Mm.
not a war between patriarchy and feminism or who has power in the nuclear family struggle. There's no logical rationale to anti-Black violence because it produces something else, something intangible. It gives pleasure, self-knowledge, and psychic stability to the rest of the world. And that is the key intervention that we made. It's based on Orlando Patterson's analysis of slavery and social death. That's his book. And one
Mhm.
of the things Orlando Patterson says is that if you want to have an organized society, you have to have an ocean of violence to set it up. You can't set up any kind of structural society by people saying, hey, let's come together and transform from feudalism to capitalism.
Mhm.
No, you've got to have a good 100 years of bloody war between the bourgeoisie and the feudal lords, and then you get a new system. But he says, in all these new systems, once they're set up, once people stop calling themselves serfs,
Mhm.
and move into the 19th century where everyone knows themselves as a worker.
Mhm.
Once the Algerian has acquiesced to French domination,
Mhm.
uh, once the woman has acquiesced to patriarchal domination, once the native has said, okay, the immigrants are here to stay in the Western Hemisphere, at that moment, the, the gratuitous nature of the violence that was needed to set it up goes under the table. It
Mm.
goes into remission. And it doesn't start cracking heads again until these populists revolt.
Mm.
That's a very important thing for people to get in mind because
Mm.
anti-Black violence doesn't work like that. When the Black agrees, acquiesces to his, her, or their place as slave, the violence keeps performing. The
Mm.
rituals keep going. You know that there's so many Instagram and videos of murders of Black people, and they should produce a decrease in the numbers. But instead, the more we see, the more the violence increases. So we were saying that the logic of violence against people of color is contingent. It is logical.
Mm.
The logic of violence against Black people is what we call pre-logical. It produces something other than the stealing of land,
Mm.
other than male domination, other than capitalist domination. It produces psychic stability for the rest of the human race. That is the basic nuts and bolts of the claim.
So rest of, and so this is another a critical part of the theory, or of the theory, is that it's not the black and white binary. It
Yeah.
is black versus non-black. And why is that? Why? And I understand from the global perspective, that is, but there's also, is that to decenter whiteness? And then how does that relate to white supremacy, or the notion of white supremacy?
Well, thank you. I had to work that out in layperson's term.
Mhm.
Yesterday, I worked about 9 hours on editing an interview that is appearing today as in the South African Mail and Guardian. So if I don't do a good job answering the question, then your viewers can go online either today or, the print version is coming out today, but then there's an extended version coming online. It's called the South African Mail and Guardian newspaper. And
Perhaps we can have the link put down, just so people can follow that, and we'll put that down in the
okay,
comments.
yeah. So what I say is that that is the crux of the issue here, because what I would say is that we in Afro-pessimist theory do a very rigorous job of trying to distinguish between white supremacy and anti-Blackness,
Okay.
so that there are all kinds of people in the world. I mean, most people in the world actually
Mhm.
suffer from the boot of white supremacy on their neck. Most people in the world. But most of those people are also communal perpetrators of anti-Blackness.
Hmm.
So, and now why is that? How do we get to that point? Well, it's because of what I said to your first question. The structure of violence that is ensconced in white supremacy is contingent, meaning you can actually point to how it gets triggered. Now, I don't say that it's ethical. White supremacy, there's nothing ethical and right about white supremacy. It's a phantasmagorical projection, but white supremacy is always conceptually coherent. It goes like this. We have to, as white people, bomb the hell out of Saddam Hussein so that the Ba'ath Party doesn't take over, so that we can control their oil in Iraq, so that we help the Israelis produce greater hegemony in the region. You see, all of these language, discourse-oriented, conceptual triggers and reasons are underlying white supremacy.
Mhm.
You cannot really do that with anti-Black violence because it's based on a different conceptual construction. And so I'll return very briefly to Orlando Patterson. One of the controversial claims that Patterson argues, and I would say quite well, in his book, he says, look, if you have a society where people have rights and there's a concept of freedom, you have to have in the collective unconscious, or actually physical bodies in the society, an idea of sentient beings who have no access to democracy, who have no access to consent, who have no access to rights. In other words, just like you cannot think the word cat and make sense of it
Mhm.
without also thinking the word dog as its opposite. It's a semiotic argument. Freedom as an idea requires that the psyche have some conceptual understanding of absolute unfreedom as an idea. Otherwise, the word freedom isn't going to have any meaning. So there has to be, running alongside this creation of a democratic or stratified society, there has to be accompanying it its opposite idea embodied in some people's flesh to give that community coherence. And he says that this is what slavery does for societies all across the world going back thousands of years. So he's saying that every group of people in the world have imposed slavery on other people. And every group of people in the world have been subjected to social death or slavery themselves. What we have said is that we agree with that, but we take it one step further.
Okay.
We say that you cannot find the word Black in the lexicon or the word Africa in the lexicon prior to the 625 Arab incursion into Africa in East Africa. From 625 AD to the 1300s, we have the Gulf states. We also have, as a former student from UC Irvine, Parisa Varizi, has written, Iran, Iraq, China, East Indian, and Moroccan Jews in this period, vamping on this space from south of the Sahara to north of Cape Town. And what's interesting is that they're producing a global consensus that these sentient beings in this space are not what we would call today human. In other words, they're not part of a community that we recognize. They are implements for our development. And this is so how we've expanded Patterson's argument, we say, well, for the first time in history, we have a position, and this is a very controversial claim, I must tell your viewers, because there are a lot of people in Black studies and the humanities say, no, you're absolutely wrong. Black is a cultural identity. And we're saying, no, Black is essentially a position like worker, like woman, like post-colonial. And inside of those positions, you have hundreds of thousands of cultural identities. Inside of woman, as a category of a gendered paradigm, there are hundreds of thousands of kinds of women.
But so why is it controversial? Like, why is that point controversial?
It's controversial. I'm gonna project because this is a heated debate. So you might have someone on who disagrees with me to say something more. I think it's controversial for an emotional reason.
Okay.
I think that a lot of people think that Afro-pessimism is actually making Black people into objects. No, Afro-pessimism is diagnosing a world that has made Black people into objects. Okay. There are also a lot of people who say, no, Blackness is a cultural identity, just like other cultural identities. And we're saying, no, Blackness is essentially a position like the word worker. And inside of Blackness, there are hundreds of thousands of cultural identities. And so what we find is that there's a vast difference. There's a documentary on YouTube about Black people suffering anti-Black racism in Venezuela. And the experience of their suffering is very different experientially, the content and context, than another video I saw about Black people suffering in Basra, or a film about Black people.
I was going to mention that too. I read that recently as well. And people get really mind blown that they're Black people in Iraq or Pakistan or India,
Yeah.
It's sort of like wiped out from all sorts of memories that,
And one of the things I say is, okay, so what happens to these people in Basra is that they're not allowed to be in city government. They don't have good jobs. They're ghettoized. What happens to the Black people in Venezuela is that they were mining for gold by hand, and terrorists from the government came in and shot them up and took over their ma and pa kind of panhandling and dug up the earth and destroyed it. But here's what's common. It's very different experientially, but here's what's common. They both say that what they're hearing from people in their countries are words that say, you are nothing, you are slave. Slave is a word that keeps translating and going across all these different spaces, whether it's Mauritania. And what's interesting about Mauritania is that if you take the word, I think in Mauritania is Bedain, meaning white. If you take that northern Mauritanian, and then you take one of the 280,000 to 500,000, depending upon your statistics. There are 280,000 to 500,000 people in Mauritania who are literally in chains as chattel slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you take the master from northern Mauritania and you take the chattel slave from southern Mauritania and you put them in New York City, the New York City cop will shoot them both as being Black.
Mm.
In Mauritania, they make, so what we're saying is that Blackness performatively and experientially is going to be different. You might be biracial or derogatory mulatto in Cuba, and you might be pure Black in America. You might be white in northern Mauritania, and that person might be pure Black in America. But the point is that the anxiety over the division between people and Blacks is something that organizes the collective unconscious in Cuba. It organizes the collective unconscious in Basra. It organizes the collective unconscious in Mauritania. It organizes the collective unconscious in Washington, D.C., and in Venezuela. How it performs could be different. But what's interesting to me is that in all these societies, people are anxious about where Black people are, what they're doing, and how I can be different from that.
Mm. Okay, you said something, but you just said people versus Blacks.
Yes. So in critical theory, this is another controversial thing because Black studies.
That's like, oh my God, that's giving me like, yeah. Go ahead.
If we are going to face the abyss,
mm-hmm.
then we have to recognize that words do not point to things.
Mm-hmm.
Words point to concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's why Afropessimism is so controversial is because it's saying to a critical theory tradition that goes back to Freud, actually goes back to Marx, mm-hmm. and then has a radical transformation with Derrida and Foucault and all these people in 68, and then it has another radical transformation with Said in 78. But we're saying what all these people haven't done is they haven't looked at the fact that they assume that the word human is a universal indicator of all sentient beings. Even people who are semiotic theoreticians mm-hmm. haven't critiqued and unpacked that word. And we're saying, no, it's a construct.
Mm.
It's not, it's not.
So being human is a construct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I have to take a minute with that because as a Muslim, that's just, that's for me, in our faith tradition, ins or insan is a being made to worship God, right? And every creature, including all ins, are made by God, right? So yeah, that's gonna that's a little hard for me to swallow. And it was some of the things that I was reading, I was like, I don't believe this as a human being. I do not believe this. And how does that play out in real life? Like, how does that play out with your neighbors, or just the Black community, the Black family? Like you say the Black family doesn't exist. What does that mean? And how does that, doesn't that play into white supremacist notions? Like that's what those are the things that they use to hurt the Black community.
I don't think one should be afraid to diagnose one's suffering.
Mm.
I don't think one should be afraid to, there's a lot of, especially people who are trained in Anglo-American pedagogy. What I mean by that is that there's an impoverishment that I have experienced, that everyone has experienced who has gone through a British or American educational system. And the impoverishment is called empiricism. Mm-hmm. It's like, we think we know what we're looking at. Mm. And relational dynamics, you cannot go out in the world and touch capitalism. That's the impoverishment of British and American Marxists, that you go to the factory floor and you see capitalism. No, capitalism is a relational dynamic. Understanding the violence of paradigms of oppression is difficult because it's like throwing paint at the invisible man in order to make him out. But relational dynamics can be manifest empirically, but they're not something that you can touch. They're cognitive maps that people use to organize their lives and organize civil society. And so I don't believe that there's truth in words. That would be an empirical argument. And so what we've said is that, okay, if you think everyone is a human, then the onus is on you to actually explain how that's true. In other words, what are the capacities of being human being? What are the constituent elements? And most of the time, people haven't thought that far. In other words, most of the time, people are not making a counter argument. What they're doing is mobilizing an emotional assertion. And an assertion isn't an argument. So I would say that there are people in the world who have, as part of their ontological makeup, which is, say, the metaphysics of their being, certain elements. One element is consent. In other words, I, as a human being, possess consent. When you murder me, when you rape me, when you steal my land, you have violated me because you've abrogated my consent. I did not give you my consent to that. So that's one thing. The other thing is the capacity for recognition, which is to say, I am recognized by my interlocutor and by my enemy. I'm recognized by both my comrades and my enemy as having the capacity to transform endless duration into time or the event. In other words, this is getting really metacritical here. So I'm trying to be as using as much common speech as I can. The other thing we have to understand is that, like, I'm looking at the clock right now, and in California it says 12:20:35. We have to understand that that is a construct. There's no such thing as 12:35. That is labors of community going into endless duration and producing the event. There's a place called Turtle Island where you are. It was conquered by whites, and they now call it America. So that is limitless space being transformed into place. And so what both warring parties amongst humans agree is that even degraded humans, the most degraded form of human is an indigenous person. And then, in terms of the most exalted form of human is a white, but they're all human in the sense that they all recognize each other's capacity for transforming space into place and duration into the event. They all recognize each other as having consent. It's just that as a white supremacist, I, Donald Trump, am going to violate your consent by invading you, but I recognize that you have it, because I'll negotiate with you and I'll war with you. They all have reciprocity. They can do the same back and forth to each other. So these are the ontological constituent elements of what most people have never taken the word to define. And so what Patterson has argued, and what I agree with, and what Afropessimism agrees with, to have those things, you've got to have someone walking around in your brain or in society who does not have consent. In other words, their body and what they produce are just an extension, like a third arm of the master. They're implements. They don't have consent. They don't have the capacity, they're not recognizing having the capacity to transform space into place. or duration into time. Now, here's the sticky point. In all those people's mind who are designated Black/slave, they, I, don't think of themselves in an ongoing way as that way. I say I have a daughter. I say I have a granddaughter. I say I have a father. I say I have brothers and sisters. That is important, very important. But it also is inessential, because we have argued that which I say about myself cannot find a home in the collective unconscious of all other people, which is precisely why the trauma of a person in Basra, Venezuela, Cuba, United States, who is Black, is performatively different, but it is the same structure. They're all saying we don't get recognized and incorporated as beings in this society. And I would argue that that has made a lot of people angry. This analysis has made a lot of people sad, but it hasn't made anyone offer a counter rigorous argument. I'm waiting for it.
You're waiting for that argument. Okay, I want to, so there's some questions coming in. Colleen is saying, in other words, haven't you simply ontologized white supremacy, which is precisely what white supremacists want?
No, I haven't. What I've done is me and David Merritt and Saidiya Hartman and many other people, Zakiya Iman Jackson, what we have done is said, here is how structural and performative violence operates. And it operates in and on the Black body in ways that are different than any other group of oppressed people. Now, y'all, Colleen, need to talk to me about a counter-analysis of structural violence. You don't want to say, I mean, this is what I mean by a sentimental assertion, you know? Like, aren't you just doing the master's work? I'm like, well, the master hasn't actually made a critical, and even white leftist critical theorists, even my own professor, Edward Said, did not do a rigorous analysis of structural violence.
So, and then you say that to truly destroy this master-slave dynamic is to collapse world civilization. So can you elaborate on on that, and any personal accounts or historical facts that have led you to this conclusion?
Well, I won't make any tactical answers to that, because that'll land me in prison.
No, I meant, you know, I don't want to go to prison.
I'm always very careful never to say how this comes about, because if you really stop and think about the destruction of African flesh from 625 AD all the way to the present, you're talking about an ocean of violence that is similar to the violence that set up patriarchy, that set up colonialism, that set up capitalism, but it's very different in the sense that it never goes into remission. The rituals of lynchings must be repeated, and they must be visually displayed so that all others can understand that, yes, that kind of thing could happen to me, but if it happened to me, it's because I didn't let the white people have my oil, or I didn't let the Israelis have my land, or I crossed the border. That kind of thing could happen to me, but if it happened to me, there'd have to be a reason. And then we could go, whew, I know I'm alive because I'm not Black, because it happens to them as a practice of human renewal. And so, yeah, I don't know what, maybe direct me a little bit more in terms of what you want me to say, because maybe I'm getting off track.
So one thing that I did, maybe we can talk a little bit about, you write about, your Palestinian friend who talked about his embarrassment that he felt by being touched by Israeli soldiers. And then he mentions that this soldier is an Ethiopian Jew, and that was so, and that was a moment of reflection for you. And so let's talk about that, because this is something that even in our work, when we're working on all these different issues, anti-genocide work, and and many times it is our Black brothers and sisters who will be standing in line and filling out the forms and writing to Congress people and doing all the a lot of work, because they feel like they understand, and they're always in line to help. But then there's also within the Muslim community, there's also this discussion about when we're always so fired up about all these oppressions overseas and elsewhere, but we don't have that same sort of feelings, or same sort of like uh, not then the money investment isn't there. None of that is there when we're talking about oppression here in the United States. So, and then there's a lot of, like, currently, especially under the current situation, there's a lot of talks and about anti-racism and looking within ourselves and reading ourselves, taking that out of the community. So that is some of that background where we're coming from. So what is I'd like, I want to hear from you within Afro-pessimism. Where does that take us? Is all of this useless? There's no self-reflection? What does that mean for any sort of justice work? Like, within, for example, the Muslim community, which is Black, which is white, which is Indonesian, Rohingya, Uyghur, Kashmiri. What does this mean for us? Like, how do we use your work?
I would not be presumptuous to tell you how to use my work. Let me make some observations, though.
Be presumptuous. It's okay. We're here to learn.
So here's. I mean, I feel I shouldn't have to say this, but I want it on the record in case I am a rabid anti-American, and I am a rabid anti-Israeli. I'm not someone who supports Palestinian domination in the form of a caliphate. I mean, my politics are more secular, and kind of, many people I know who are Muslim friends of mine would say it's just too old school. It's based on Said, and we moved on from there. But if I had a political dream for this country, or political dream for the Israeli state and the West Bank, it would be a dream that was not a Jewish state and was not a caliphate, and where ethnicity and religion were not widgets of cultural, social, or political advancement. Mm-hmm. And having said that, I also believe that as a Black person, it would just a day-to-day experience would be better to live in Ramallah than to live in Tel Aviv. It would be better to live in Havana than to live in Compton, However, here's the however. What I'm trying to say in the opening chapter of this book is that I'm working in solidarity with my friend during the first Intifada. His cousin blows himself up with a bomb that he's making. It's not a suicide bomb. He accidentally blew it up. And my friend is mourning at our lunch. We're working together. And at that moment, what happens, you see, what I believe is that the psyche is divided into realms, the conscious realm, the unconscious realm, and then your structural position. I won't get too much into psychoanalysis, but what I will say is that you can never know yourself, because you have these three realms of the psyche that are working as gears in different directions, in different ways, That's why I don't believe people when they claim their sexual orientation. They're claiming their sexual orientation at the level of their preconscious mind, but the unconscious mind doesn't behave according to the conscious mind's demands. Mm-hmm. The unconscious mind has sexual desire that is polymorphous and goes all like that. It's just that it's not performed necessarily, So what I'm saying is that the psyche is a contradictory set of three engines in one head. And at this moment, he's mourning. And normally when we're talking to each other, like you and I are talking through our preconscious and conscious minds, I have no idea what's going on in your unconscious mind. You have no idea what's going on in mine. And not only that, you won't have any idea what's going on in your unconscious mind at this moment until sometime later when something happens to you. You go through psychoanalysis or you have a trauma that smacks you back to something that you've repressed, you know? So he had a trauma. And what happened is that he's speaking through the libidinal economy, through his unconscious. And I'm not even really there. And he's saying, he's giving a litany of all kinds of abuses that you have to go through in Ramallah to get to so-called Israel. And he says it's really bad when the Israeli soldiers run their hands along your body, but it's worse when the person is an Ethiopian Jew. Now, what that means is that the force of his unconscious, which is to say, we're going back to all these towns I mentioned around the globe, from Basra to Iran to, is that there's an anxiety about the slave, and the slave is needed, and there's an anxiety. And this is something that is part of the collective unconscious of Palestine, and it is part of the collective unconscious of Israel. And it's a shared thing around the world. I love Cuba more than any country in the world, but I was there for 6 weeks, and it's deep within the collective unconscious of revolutionary Cubans, okay? And so what, you know, for example, then years later, I did a workshop on Afro-pessimism for 35 leaders of Black Lives Matter in New York City. One of the stories I heard was the way in which they had gone to Palestine to form solidarity. And, but the brothers and sisters in Palestine were evasive and ambivalent about their requests to have a sit down with Black people on the West Bank. And so they kept having to say, no, where are they? We want to meet them. You know, and that shouldn't have to happen, you know? And finally, towards the end of the tour, they meet them. And we find that these Black Palestinians, who are also, like me, rabidly anti-Israeli, have this deep sense of suffering and isolation in this occupied territory that they're experiencing from Palestinians who are not Black. The same thing happened to me in Cuba. The Black Cubans said to the Black Americans, we need to talk. And the non-Black Cubans were saying, no, everybody's a communist. You can't go have a little talk with black on Black, you know? And when we finally got it to happen, what we found is that, you know, there's suffering from the anxiety of anti-Blackness amongst the most revolutionary Cubans, people in the world, in the same way that everyone else is. So I think that this is part of the dynamic, you know? Why did not the Palestinians who hosted the Black Lives Matter say, as the first point on your agenda, we want you to meet some Black Palestinians? You know? Why did they have to keep hammering that for 2 weeks?
Wow, that true. I have a question from someone who follows your work, and they had sent this prior to this interview. They wanted to know, with the burning of the police precinct within the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, how are you thinking of this current moment? Is it unique in any way, and does it signal a growing political mass consciousness amongst protesters?
What was the last part? Because I didn't hear that. Is it unique in any way?
And does it signal a growing political mass consciousness amongst protesters?
I am one day cautiously optimistic, one day not so optimistic. Yeah, pessimistic. Yeah. Here's what I think. I think it's very difficult to impossible for even well-meaning people on the left to engage Black people at the level of the elements of Black suffering. I think that there's a knee-jerk response that is not it's not calculated, it's not mischievous, but it just says, okay, can't we all talk about what we have in common as oppressed people, you know? And so this is, and I think there's a reason for that. And I'm worried, I'll tell the reason in a minute, but I'm worried that we could be moving into that, even though this started all as pure Black rage. And one of the ways that we might be moving into that is by people talking about policing as it affects all oppressed communities, as opposed to talking about policing and Blackness. And I think the reason for that is because I think in everyone's unconscious, one understands that you really cannot think through a concept that would solve or redress Black suffering. It's too comprehensive. You could say, at a macro level, the first step is the end of the Israeli occupation, a second step, the end of the Israeli state, and boom. Now we've got Palestinians in a moment of sovereignty and self-determination, and we'll see what happens from there. You could say the same thing about here, even though it's phantasmagorical, there are 280 million settlers in this country of all kinds of races. I don't see how the Indians are going to get their land back, but it is conceptually coherent. You can go to the map and say, there's no Soviet Union, so this country is not sacred and eternal. It doesn't always have to exist. But you cannot say, what would it take to cure anti-Black suffering? Because it's not about loss. It's something bigger than loss. It's the extraction of all cosmological functions, as Frantz Fanon would write. So everyone knows, this is what the meaning of the word that Frantz Fanon puts forth called negrophobogenesis, phobia. So everyone knows that the Palestinian is a phobogenic subject. The Palestinian walks into the room and stimulates anxiety, but the anxiety actually can be clear conceptually. This person embodies, even if they're conservative, this person embodies the demand for their land back. The worker is a phobogenic subject. The worker walks into the corporation, whoa, this person embodies the destruction of surplus value and profits. But the Black walks into the room and is a phobogenic, not subject, a phobogenic object. This person embodies the end of the world because that's what was taken from this person. And so very few people can go there, although they like to have Black people around in their groups, because what comes out of a body or a configuration of flesh that has had everything taken from it is a kind of rage, a kind of music, a kind of dance, a kind of determination that spurs other groups on in ways that are unimaginable, because other people are fighting for something that they need to salvage. They're fighting with nothing to lose. And that's a different kind of fight.
Is that what is the power of Afro-pessimism?
I think so.
Pessimism powerful? Can it be an enabler?
Oh, I think it is. I mean, I was I have a very good Iranian friend, and I was at a bookstore and giving a reading, and she raised her hand and said, I like your work. We share a lot of common. She's part of the Communist Party in Iran during the revolution before the Ayatollah. We're all different factions against the Shah, and so we kind of share political affinities. But she spoke up in this bookstore saying, I really find your work really depressing. And immediately 2 Black people shot up and said, we find it energizing. So, because what Afro-pessimism does, and we never anticipated this would happen, it connects with Black youth and Black old people. It doesn't also much connect with Black middle-aged people as much. It connects with Black youth and Black old people who don't give a damn. Who are energized by fire, not by buildings.
Well, I wish we had more time to talk some more. I know we're at the end of the show. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you all. You guys go buy the book, Afro-Pessimism. We'll have the links in on our Facebook Live, so where you can purchase it. And thank you so much, Dr. Wilderson, for being here and being a part of the show. And look forward to learning more from you. But thanks again for being here.
I've enjoyed it. You take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.